Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is David Novak. It has been my practice with the advent of this channel as a booktube channel to periodically make a video in which I discuss what I have been recently reading. I call these my recent reads videos. I was taking my pattern from other booktubers who do such a thing. So I've made a playlist. If you go to that playlist, you can see videos which talk about all of the books I have read since becoming a booktuber. Thank you all who responded kindly to my return video yesterday. I've just been off a while because of pressing matters. My time is not my own, and I'm not sure if I will be back regularly at this point. But beyond that, my focus right now has removed away from booktube a little bit. I'm still managing to read. And I'm still managing to watch a good number of booktube videos. But I've also started watching a lot of videos dealing with current events. And it's probably a habit I need to put aside soon. But nevertheless, it gives me cause to think about different things. So usually I talk about what I have finished, and I will do that momentarily. Let me talk about what I've just started, China's Cosmopolitan Empire. This is the Tang Dynasty, and Mark Edward Lewis is becoming my go-to historian on China. This book is of the Harvard Imperial China series, which consists of 6 books. And I mention that because the first 2, actually the first 3 books in the series are by Lewis. And so it's giving me a pretty good overview, it will be through the Tang, of a subject that I am woefully ignorant. I've been on the periphery of things Chinese for the bulk of my adult years, but I've never studied Chinese history or Chinese literature hardly. And Lewis's books are giving me a good introduction. That said, I believe I did a separate video in which I talked about possibly these 2 books. And I'm glad if I did, because I've lost some of the thoughts which I had for those. I finished China Between Empires probably about 3 weeks ago, and I finished this one before that. So nothing is fresh in my mind, and I don't tend to retain information. So what I did learn, I may well not have. But I am pleased to report that each of these books can stand alone, and because of that, Lewis does a certain amount of backtracking, recapping previous history so that you are up to speed. And aside from just the writing as English, one thing that I like about this series books is that, well, let me show you the chapter contents are one thing, but you know, Steve Donahue took a day off of BookTube, and then when he came back, he said, every time you take a hiatus and come back, it's kind of hard to get into the swing of things. And that is proving true for me. Uh, aside from what I made yesterday, it's been a couple of weeks since I made a BookTube video, and while my thoughts are usually inconsistent and incoherent, they are probably more so now because not only do I not remember what's in the books, but I have sort of let go of the customary habit of trying to have little things in mind that I would like to speak about. But be that as it may, the series as a whole has a lot of good back matter. There's a lot of footnoting or endnoting, which can be helpful. Each volume has a full bibliography, which I've noticed more and more books are starting to skip. There's a sort of timeline recap of major events happening in the period covered by the book. And then there is also a timeline of the Chinese dynasties as a full thing. So there's your Chinese dynasties. So I'm just very little into the third book, but the first two were very good, and have filled in gaps for me and provided a foundation. The last book, China Between Empires, began to instruct me in some of the literature of the period. And this would be a course for further study. But unfortunately, it seems that the more scholarly books dealing with translations of ancient poets are published by university presses. And in that case, just to get a book of poems, you're talking of upwards of $50. And it's a hard call for me to justify that kind of expense for a book, which if I do read it, I will read once, not likely again. I would like to do that because it would help me to assimilate everything more. So apparently the Tang as well also involved a good literary explosion, and the best loved Chinese poetry comes from this period. So I'm looking forward to finding out more about that. But I will leave these books aside for the moment and talk about the novels that I have finished. Where is it? Here is one, Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. And the other one that I finished was The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. And here I am sorry that my thoughts are less coherent than they could or should be. Let me read a quote, a paragraph or part of a paragraph from later in the novel of Daniel Deronda. Something that I posted at Facebook. And it's not my aim to spoil anything. I went into this book absolutely blind, not knowing anything, and I am very glad that that's how I went. But this quote, of necessity, will reveal part of the plot, which you may rather not have presented to you. But it's what I care to talk about. I'll start with the quote, and then maybe I'll just read the the Facebook post, which I did. It looks like a week or so ago. I am going to the East to become better acquainted with the condition of my race in various countries there, said Deronda, gently anxious to be as explanatory as he could on what was the impersonal part of their separateness from each other. The idea that I am possessed with is that of restoring a political existence to my people, making them a nation again, giving them a national center, such as the English have, though they too are scattered over the face of the globe. This is a task which presents itself to me as a duty. I am resolved to begin it, however feebly. I am resolved to devote my life to it. At the least, I may awaken a movement in other minds, such as has been awakened in my own. And then I'll go on to what I wrote at Facebook. Lines spoken by Daniel Deronda in George Eliot's novel of that title. In the course of the story, Daniel learns that he is of Jewish ancestry and begins to identify with his heritage. It's a novel on the scope of Romola in its way, in that I sense Eliot undertook a mammoth research project upon herself in order to fashion it. There were chapters of unvarnished philosophy or discussions of what it means to be Jewish, and they, being actionless, were hard reading, but overall I'd say the work counts as her masterpiece. I probably like it better than Middlemarch because, in its way, it's so odd, and also for the full display of Eliot's consummate artistry. But I still like it less than Romola, mainly because perhaps Florence of the time of Savonarola interests me more than Judaism, though for a discussion of European Jewry of the time, it held many lessons. Wikipedia credits the 1876 novel with a sympathetic rendering of Jewish proto-Zionist ideas, so its historical overtones exceed the fictional. Now I've begun Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. He is proving a completely different kettle of fish so far as Victorian authors go. Highly reminiscent of Poe, though I don't know if there's a connection. Particularly early on in The Woman in White, Collins reminded me very much of Edgar Allan Poe. And for the first half of the book, I loved his storytelling. In fact, let me read you a little bit from that. This is the edition that I used. Bantam, I think, yeah. But my copy does not have a later introduction or preface, which Collins added to the book. It was immensely successful, and I think I will read something of that, which is pertinent to my thoughts on the book. It is no affectation on my part to say that the success of this book has been especially welcome to me because it implied the recognition of a literary principle which has guided me since I first addressed my readers in the character of a novelist. I have always held the old-fashioned opinion that the primary object of a work of fiction should be to tell a story. And I have never believed that the novelist who properly performed this first condition of his art was in danger on that account of neglecting the delineation of character. For this plain reason, that the effect produced by any narrative of events is essentially dependent not on the events themselves, but on the human interest which is directly connected with them. It may be possible in novel writing to present characters successfully without telling a story. But it is not possible to tell a story successfully without presenting characters. Their existence as recognizable realities being the sole condition on which the story can be effectively told. The only narrative which can hope to lay a strong hold on the attention of readers is a narrative which interests them about men and women for the perfectly obvious reason that they are men and women themselves. I think that's a good summation of what I know of Collins's technique from the book. I spake that I liked the first half better. It's one of those Victorian novels that likes to present the matter of the story as factual via an assemblage of different documents. So we have notebooks, diaries of characters presented, which recount everything. We have something written by a lawyer who figures in the story. He contributes a number of chapters. And the middle part where it broke down, you have a small segment told by what we have come to call an unreliable narrator, sort of an ignorant narrator, a stupid narrator, who also figures as a character elsewhere in the book. And then that is followed by another brief narration by a character who is a naive Christian, let us say, and who is looking at everything through an extreme, I want to say positivist, but I don't know that is, I don't mean anything to do with positivism, a positivist Christian lens. And it's both of those chapters were tiring. Now, the plot involves a resemblance between two characters. You know, in books of this type, when there are two characters who look exactly alike, that there is going to occur some kind of substitution. It's de rigueur in novels. And this kind of being on the edge of a mystery novel, you can sort of see in advance where it goes. And I'm glad to say that Collins does not dwell on the mystery of it. He does not try to leave you in the dark. There's maybe a chapter where he flirts with that. He teases a little bit. Which character is he talking about? Which one, you know. But so I give him credit for that. It's a masterfully told story, and the inclusion of a couple of unreliable narrators is a personal bugaboo with me. I just can't stand novels that have that kind of narrator. Fortunately, the entirety of it does not consist of unreliable narrators, and mostly there is one character who tells the story, and then the conceit is that he assembles these other documents because it's a true story, of course. And the writing is good, but this happens to be a novel that booktuber Mary Maya Mendoza read some years ago, and she mentioned in a comment that somewhere around the halfway point, she felt that the novel just got too long. And I felt that exact same thing. I wished he would cut it down. I understand that Victorian novels tended to be serialized, and so it was nothing for an author in that month's installment or whatever to just include an entire summary of what had gone before in the plot. And I found that tedious. And A lot of it involved solving little mysteries that could have been solved a lot easier, or mysteries with which I had little tolerance for. So a great deal centered upon what date a certain event happened. We're living in an age when emails are sent. And so if an email was sent, you know exactly what date that happened. And if it talks about, oh, something, you know. And so it felt like chapters were going on about this. What date did this happen? And you knew it was going to be resolved, and you kind of knew how it was going to be resolved, but yet you had chapters about that. And there were several items of that sort. So the idea of storytelling is very interesting, and Collins is a masterful storyteller. I will grant him that, at least in this book, which I should add, just as an aside, it's been on my shelf for a number of years, but I finally picked it up as part of my Victober reading in memory of Jennifer Brooks, a booktuber who died something like the first couple of days of January of this year. I had followed her channel for no more than 6 months, I think, but her videos were really a touchstone for me in dealing with Victorian literature and dealing with Italian history. So I believe that this author was her favorite, and this, of course, is his acknowledged masterpiece, and I want to go back and see what she had to say about it. I would bet that she made a video about it. But he will not be my favorite author for the reasons which he laid out in his preface, which is that I understand that telling a story is the sine qua non of a novel, perhaps. But for me, it's not the most important thing. I prefer a novel to have some kind of a higher aim to it than just telling a good yarn. And that is why, of the Victorians, quite possibly George Eliot is becoming my favorite author. I have read 4 of Eliot's books now. The first one I ever read years ago was Middlemarch. And I think if I revisited it now in light of this, I might have different perceptions on her writing. The first time you read an author, there is the factor of alienness that you have to get through. And now I've read enough of Eliot that is not a bother. So I might see it differently now. I liked Middlemarch. But it was some years later, possibly 2 years ago now, when I read her novel, Romola, that everything gelled for me with Eliot. I love that story. It was a big project which she undertook, researching historical Florence, and that was another great lacuna, another great gap in my knowledge. I've been to Florence. I've read the letters of Michelangelo. So the topic of Savonarola has come up often enough, and I never understood in the least what his role was in the Florence of his day. And she fleshed out his story magnificently. So the book had that historical overlay, which indeed interested me more than the petty adversities faced by her fictional characters. So I loved that book. Last year I read Silas Marner, which I think I just saw something that said it was written about the same time as Romola, or during a hiatus while she was getting her research together. Maybe she needed money. And that book was less satisfactory. I enjoyed it, and in a way, it may have a sticking power that the others don't, a sticking power akin to that of Edith Wharton's Ethan Frome, which is a very pared down tale without a lot of extraneous matter. But that contradicts what I'm about to say, which is that Daniel Deronda probably pleased me more, not just because of its greater cohesion. I think Silas Marner shows signs of her having intended to go one way with the narrative and then going a different way. But the thought that Eliot has a much greater theme that she is working through, that at times was a deficit. There were chapters of nothing but discussion with characters introduced solely for the purpose in a pub or whatever, to discuss what it means to be a Jew in today's world. What did I say, 1876? And those were tedious beyond belief. I'm not a reader of philosophy, and then that kind of extemporaneous philosophizing, I grant that it was important to Eliot to do that. And the proto-Zionism surprised me. I had not expected that in Eliot, even once I became aware of the centrality that Judaism would have in the story. Now, I think I knew going in that Daniel Deronda had a central Jewish character, something to that effect. But Eliot gave a lot of thought to the subject, to the topic of Judaism, to its history, to what it meant as a race, even though now we know genetically there is no such race per se, or even races, I would guess. And she wanted to investigate that. And you get a very interesting picture of the place of persons of Jewish descent in England of Eliot's day. So, as I had said in the Facebook post, I'm not highly interested in Judaism or Jewish things. I am more interested in the flowering of the Renaissance in Florence. So that leaves Romola at the top of my list. But I probably would put Deronda as the second favorite of mine, just because of the audacity of it, of what she attempted. It is likely that if I continue to be alive, I may try to read the rest of Eliot's oeuvre. It's very unlikely that I will go back to Wilkie Collins. I get that sometimes you just want a good yarn, a good story. But for me, reading has always been more about trying to figure out the world. And so Eliot, I think, takes you closer to that goal. Collins gives you a pretty good story if you can tolerate the excesses of verbiage and whatnot. Sometime last year, I think I was considering reading something by Dickens, and I pulled out A Tale of Two Cities, which I read in high school, I think, and read the first couple of pages. Now, that was Jennifer Brooks's favorite book by Dickens, and I seriously considered it, and I found the attempt, or the attempts, the stretched out attempts at humor just grating upon my last nerve, so to speak. It was just intolerable. He is working so hard to be funny in that. And at this point, I may not go back to it, but I understand how, with all of his excesses, Dickens yet remains possibly the most important, I would say possibly second to George Eliot, of the Victorian novelists. Now, I should say I've read Tess by Thomas Hardy, and that was a great book, but I hesitate to commit to anything further because it was very depressing. And my understanding is that a Hardy novel is just scenes of bleakness after scenes of bleakness. So possibly one day I will go with Hardy. I shouldn't be trying to rank these authors into a hierarchy. But Dickens, for all of his flaws, his excesses of verbiage, he yet retains, I think, that higher purpose, at least I would imagine, in his best novels, that Wilkie Collins lacks here. As I progressed through the novel, the similarity with Poe was less, but the earliest pages, I mean, I would say the earliest third at least, felt so much like Poe. Now, Poe was born maybe 20 years before Collins, and I don't know when this was written in the career of Collins, and I don't know if Poe's stories were widely transmuted across the pond in time for Collins to read them. I know that Poe had a huge impact upon the writers of France, so I wouldn't doubt that he did. And it would be worth my checking into. Just the Wikipedia entry that I found had nothing to say, but I'm not likely to read a biography of this author. And I'm not likely to read another book by his, with the caveat that I believe Jennifer Brooks has a video in which she talks about the writing of Collins in light of, well, not in light of, in light of his works as a whole, because she read everything, I believe, and she liked Collins even when he was not on. So even his not so good novels, she liked them. This was obviously his best work, I am guessing, but I could be wrong because popular reputation does not always coincide with mine. And so it is quite possible that another one of his novels, which is not so well liked, would be a favorite of mine. So I'm open to that possibility, but as I say, I would consult with the late Jennifer Brooks first before deciding to do anything of that sort. I've had a couple of books come in. Wonderful Life. Don't know if I will get to this. It's bigger perhaps than I might like, but it's going to be there. And I've also had this come in because I continue to be fairly disturbed about the events happening in Palestine and other parts of what we call the Middle East, in Lebanon, and read somewhere that this was, well, not this, there was a book that Thomas Suarez wrote titled State of Terror. I'm pretty sure, State of Terror. Yeah, published by Olive Branch Press, and it's one of those books that if you want to buy it, and I would rather read that than this, it's going to cost you a couple of $1,000 because that's the cheapest price you can find. I read somewhere else, somebody said that this was a revision of that book. I see nothing in the front matter of this to claim that it's a revision of that book. So it sounds like it may be a revisitation of the same topic, gone into greater detail. And at 400 pages, I was appalled, frankly, when I got it out of the box because it's longer than what I care to commit to. My reading is not that good, and if I am going to be reading 400 pages, or like in this case 300 pages, I would rather have my consciousness over in ancient China. But that said, it is a topic of concern to any living human being right now, what is happening in Palestine, in Lebanon, and in the world at large. And how U.S. foreign policy is shaping those events. So at least I got this book. I had had a book by Stephen Salita recently, also a Palestinian author or author of Palestinian descent, that I wanted to look at, and I looked at it and I decided it was not for me. But I think, and somewhere over there I have a novel which a viewer recommended dealing with the situation, I think, of Palestine or Israel-Palestine. And that looks more interesting to me than a work of history or even a political polemic. But I may hold off on this. I have a book ordered from the library written by Adam Kirsch, who is a writer I much admire. He was especially insightful. I think it was after the events of 9/11. I can't remember now. And no, I think with the election of Donald Trump, perhaps, and the descent into fascism that was seen and foretold for this country when Trump won the presidency. It almost happened. We got past it by a squeak, let's say. And he has a new book out, something denouncing the lie of settler colonialism as it pertains to Israel, or something like that. So he seems to be delving into the Jewish question of our times. And so I'm number one in the queue at Chicago Public Library, but the book has not come in yet. They do not own it yet. That's how new it is. Of course, as with any book, you can get it quicker by buying a copy at Amazon than you could by trying to order it from the Chicago Public Library. I'm the one and only person in the queue, but I may wait for that to come and then try to look at these together. And I say look at, not read. The events of past year particularly have, of course, forced my attention onto the Middle East, and I have certain mysteries clearing up. So viewers of the channel know that I was not well educated, I was not well read, and I have been involved in a process of trying to educate myself, or as a woman that I once worked with used to say, edumacate myself, ever since I became a serious writer of poetry. History is a broad spectrum of time periods, happenings, and those which were most current were of least interest to me and continue to be of least interest to me. But I've mentioned my friend Marcia, who was sort of a literary mentor to me. One of the first books that I read, we met in college, was I and Thou by Martin Buber. And then later on, I appropriated another book by Martin Buber. I've made my confession in another video. And Buber became important to me. I tried to like his other books as much and didn't. I want to revisit him again soon after a hiatus of a lifetime. His Tales of the Hasidism were good. I did not like them as much as the Tales of the Sufi Masters by Idris Shah that I read about at the same time. But I remember reading Buber and frequently coming across the word Zionism, which was a big issue of the day. And you have to understand a person who is ignorant and has no knowledge. I had no understanding of what was being talked about. And I don't know if I ever looked it up in the dictionary and tried to figure it out, but we didn't have Wikipedia. And so for most of my adult life, again, not having an interest in the area geographically or historically, until I read Stephen Runciman's History of the Crusades, I couldn't make head or tail of the word Zionism. Now I think I understand it better. And I also understand that it's not a word of particular interest to me. Any field of study will have a specialized vocabulary with words that are not necessarily of interest to the broader tapestry of the language as a whole. And Zionism is certainly one of those. I remember when I was a kid, I had a best friend who was Jewish and went with him to temple a number of times. The folks at the temple were very welcoming, and I loved that experience. I also went to various denominations of churches occasionally, whose people were never so welcoming. But you would be aware that there were separate vocabularies even. And coming from the Western tradition, you are aware, say, of the word Gentile, which is another one of those words which only holds meaning in that specific context. And so if you grow and you have a broader perspective of that, say you have a perspective which includes a lot of China and Japan, and then you come across the idea, well, there is a group of people named Jewish, and they separate people into a couple types. You have Jewish people and you have Gentiles. And so somebody from Japan is what we would call a Gentile. So from the Japanese perspective, you would take that and you would say, oh, that's a curiosity, that's interesting, but it wouldn't likely be any more than that. And so that's more the perspective which I try to approach things from, because as a writer of poetry, that larger tapestry of language has always been the more important concern for me. And all of these little subsets of vocabularies and whatnot are just of less importance. So that goes a long way off from a recent Reads video. I guess that's my way of saying welcome back, though I, at this point, don't make the promise that I will be pumping out videos at the rate of one a day, which I had been doing for a spell there. So thank you very much for stopping by my channel.